Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us yet again for our second out of 5 Tinnitus Collaborative Sessions. My name is Dr. Craig Casper. I have had the privilege of pulling together a group of really intelligent and kind of forward-thinking clinicians that are right at the edge of what we're doing in the world of tinnitus care. And we really wanted to share all of this with as many people as possible. So we decided to put together these live stream events to not only do them live, but also share them, I guess, forever with anybody who wants to watch them on YouTube as well. But for those of you who decided to join us live today, we really do appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you. There's just a couple of housekeeping items that I wanted to bring to the front before we get started with a guest who I've been talking to for a while, and I'm really excited to have as a part of our sessions today. But just wanted to recognize some of the folks who have helped us get the word out about our Tinnitus Collaborative Sessions and kind of get the word out and get people to sign up and to be a part of this. First is NYHD, New York Hearing Doctors, and the Institute of Hearing and Balance, which is my practice based in New York City. Modern Tinnitus, which is another practice that I have started with Dr. Cliff Olson based in Scottsdale, Arizona. Lanier, which is the wonderful new, or not so new anymore, but tinnitus product and bimodal neuromodulation device from the wonderful folks at Neuromod. Hearing Doctors of New Jersey, Audiology Associates of Westchester, Mid-Island Audiology on Long Island, and Liberty Hearing Centers based in Brooklyn. Just wanted to say thank you to all of those businesses and private practices who have really just helped us spread the word. And that's what we mean by sponsorship, is they've just really kind of supported everything that we're doing to get really good, solid information out into the universe regarding tinnitus care. Regarding the Tinnitus Collaborative Sessions, we have some primary goals. Primarily, the initial goal is really to provide an educational platform, as I said, highlighting the important work of some of the professionals from across the spectrum of tinnitus care and across the tinnitus care landscape. We really want to focus on critical and, most importantly, science-based information that we can share with not only tinnitus patients, but also providers. Unfortunately, there seems to be a bit of a void, and we're trying to fill that void with good, solid, science-based information for patients as well as providers out there who might be interested in helping their patients manage the tinnitus journey. And then finally, really to provide patients with a holistic view of effective tinnitus treatments, because there's so many things that we can do to help someone who is really impacted negatively from tinnitus. And oftentimes, all of the things that we're talking about, and it might seem like it's coming from completely disparate elements or parts of the healthcare spectrum, they're all very much intertwined. So we really wanted to provide a holistic view and really help people understand there's so much that can be done to help those who are suffering and really bothered by their tinnitus. Ultimately, our goal collectively is to ensure that all patients and anyone who's impacted by tinnitus truly understands that there are caring professionals, there are science-based tools and technologies that can help, as I said. So with that, we've had, as I said, a number of different speakers lined up. If you missed the last Tinnitus Collaborative Session, which occurred just a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Rachel Cook, who is my colleague based in Modern Tinnitus in Scottsdale, Arizona, she spoke on biometric tracking, which is a really interesting thing that we've developed on the Modern Tinnitus side of the equation, and developing personalized care for tinnitus patients. I shared some of my real-world data because we've been involved in working with the Lanier system since it was FDA approved in March of last year. So if you didn't get a chance to catch that, just go to our YouTube channel and we'll give you some links here as well. And you can watch that at any point. Today we have Dr. Browne, who I will introduce in just a few moments. Later this week, Thursday, really incredible human, Patrick Lynch, who is the new CEO of the American Tinnitus Association. And Patrick's going to talk about some of the incredible things that they're doing to support the science as well as the clinical care behind tinnitus. In a few weeks from now, one of my colleagues, Dr. Jason Leindecker, will be talking about tinnitus retraining therapy, which is another science-based tinnitus treatment that really serves as the foundation for a lot of the things that we do from a tinnitus care perspective. And Jason is super well-versed and expert in that. And he'll be joined that day by Dr. Janet Kennedy, who will also be presenting. Dr. Kennedy is a sleep psychologist, and she'll be sharing some simple strategies for healthy sleep. That's so critical for tinnitus because we know that tinnitus and sleep are massively intertwined. And then we'll wrap up our sessions with Dr. Jennifer Gans, who's a good friend of mine based in San Francisco, and she will be talking about anxiety and tinnitus. So if you haven't tuned in for the first one, make sure you check that one out. This one will be live and also recorded on YouTube. And then all the other ones, if you'd like, please do sign up. Keep in mind, you have to sign up for each session individually. And you can do that through the QR code that is on your screen right now to sign up for the remaining tinnitus sessions. So on to today. This is a person who I'm really, really excited about. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Browne not too long ago, actually, but I feel like I've known him for most of my life. We had a really good opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas regarding brain health and kind of the interactions with the brain and tinnitus and stress and nutrition. And he's just a wonderful human, but he's also probably one of the smartest brain scientists that I've encountered. So I had asked him if he would kind of be able to bless us with the information that he has in his head, because he really has so much to share. So just want to give you a quick bio on Dr. Browne. He is the president of Cognitive Care Management, which is based in Scottsdale, Arizona, and also the founder of Neuronutrition. Dr. Browne is a nutritional neuroscientist, which is such a unique title because I don't know if I've ever actually heard of that before, but he's a nutritional neuroscientist and possesses over 20 years of expertise in the fields of aging, dementia, nutrition, and clinical research. He's a noted public speaker and a frequent lecturer, and he's also a sought-after consultant and national expert in brain health. Dr. Browne, his research interests include examining the role of nutrition and non-pharmacological approaches to reduce the risks of dementia, cognitive decline, inflammation, and abnormal aging. And now these are topics, especially as we think about not only lifespan, we're thinking about health span, not only how much longer we can live, but how we can live a longer, healthier life. And the brain is at the center of all of this. So that said, I'm going to bring Dr. Browne up to the stage. I'm going to remove this. I'm going to add Dr. Browne to the stage here and welcome Dr. Browne. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, my pleasure. It's great being here. And this is such a wonderful opportunity to talk about how the inner workings of the brain really are a big part of this hearing continuum that you specialize in. And so it's just an honor and a privilege to be here and to be able to kind of share some thoughts on really how the brain, its response, and how we can really live our best lives and preserve all of our brain function.
Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to it. I'm going to drop off the stage here. I'll pull up your slides here in just a second. And then once you're done with your session, I'll jump back in. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions.
Yeah, fantastic. And so again, it's great to be here with you. And I've got a lot of things to unpack, and some of it starts with a historical perspective. And part of that historical perspective, change slide, led me to craft this sort of a motto in terms of where we are now and where we need to go. And that's the majority of Americans suffer from accidental aging. We struggle to maintain good health and quality of life in middle age and beyond. While there's no way to avoid aging, we do have control over our rate of aging. Our finely tuned bodies thrive on a balanced, holistic approach that allows us to age with intention. So this is us in America. We graduate from high school and we think we have the world by the tail. We may go to college or may start a job, but we start this pursuit of the next phase in life, and we hit it with all the rigor that we can. And before we know it, we're in our mid-20s, starting our first job. We're kind of trying to escalate our careers, and we may mess around and fall in love. And then all of a sudden, well, we're married and it's 30 years old, and we're saying, wow, okay, here we go. And then you may start a family, and kids start coming in, and you're just kind of going through the grind of working and raising kids, and you blink and you're 40 years old. And then the throes of your kids getting older, taking them to sports and really kind of watching that growth and development happen, and you blink and you're 50. And then 50 years old comes, and you're taking on more responsibility at work, and your kids are becoming much more independent, and all of a sudden you blink, your kids have graduated, and you're 60 years old, and you're saying, wow, 60 years old. And people are saying, oh, time to plan for retirement, and so on and so forth. And before you know it, you're having that retirement party. And then all of a sudden you've got some of the aches and pains, and things aren't working well, and all sorts of dysfunction starts to happen. And you say, how the heck did I get here? And that is a typical course of accidental aging by the majority of Americans. We are just going head down, pursuing life as it comes at us. And we then find ourselves in the crux of what we know to be abnormal aging. Aches, pains, chronic disease. All of a sudden, we're taking all of these pills for some of the leading chronic conditions in our country: heart disease, stroke risk. Our blood pressure is too high. We're managing diabetes, and all of that stuff comes and hits you like a ton of bricks, and your body doesn't feel like it wants to feel anymore. You start to go through that continuum, and you find yourself, like I said, in the midst of accidental aging. Now, we have seen research and science converge to extend longevity. So longevity is at an all-time high right now. We've been able to extend longevity based on a lot of scientific discoveries. Discoveries as simple and as complex as many of the things I'm going to mention. Back in 1900, life expectancy was 45 years old. 45 years old was life expectancy. But because of these advancements in science and research, we kept on chipping away and extending longevity. Back in the day, rich people lived upstream and poor people lived downstream. Rich people would wash their clothes and use the restroom upstream, and it would wash downstream to where poor people were, and they would be dying of some very, very simple diseases. And one of the 20th century advances that have extended lifespan was the ability to create antibiotics, which would kill these bacterial infections that were ending millions of lives prematurely because we did not know how to adjudicate that. So having a system based on sanitation and sanitary practices all of a sudden started to increase lifespan. So 1900, it was 45. It kept on extending as we made these advances. And then another major advance was inoculation therapy. Measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, polio, and the likes were all eradicated. That took millions of lives and ended life short, was now stopped in its tracks with inoculation therapy. Very effective, again, extended lifespan. And then we look at other things. Things like automobile safety. Believe it or not, automobile accidents were the leading cause of death for younger Americans. But we since have had things like seat belts, backup cameras, anti-lock brakes, all sorts of tire technology, which then has done what? Kept people safer in cars and then extended lifespan. So again, living longer. And then on top of that, we've had some advances in maternal and child health, which have extended the lives of a 1-pound baby that was inconceivable to survive even a few generations ago. But now a 1-pound baby, thanks to the neonatal intensive care unit, can grow to be a normal functioning adult. So again, we're expanding our lifespan. Now, what comes to play is something Dr. Casper said earlier, that we want to combine longevity with quality of life. And as we age, one of the things inside of us, one of the components in us is aging as well, and that's our brain. Our brain starts to go through an aging process as well. And because we're living longer, we get to see how the brain ages in mass where we didn't before. Remember when life expectancy was cut short in the early 20th century just due to things that we hadn't developed yet? Well, now we're seeing people live longer, and we're seeing how the brain ages over time. So being able to study the brain and understand how the brain works at all stages and all ages has led to a robust science in understanding diseases of aging, specifically neurodegenerative diseases of aging. One of the things about the aging brain that we have to realize is this, that your brain evolves over time, and the brain starts to take on different characteristics at different points in life. First being, the brain fully develops and matures at age 25. The architecture of the brain is very much in an experimental phase before that, and we make a lot of decisions based on emotion and impulse rather than vetted knowledge and experience. And so when it develops fully at 25, we are able to kind of use most of the resources of the brain collectively to be able to govern ourselves and to govern the world around us. So that's a milestone in brain aging. But there's a lot of things that confound brain aging, and we're going to talk a little bit about that a little later on. But as you age, like I said, specifically you're under the throes of accidental aging like most Americans, you hit this threshold where things aren't working like they used to cognitively and in terms of being able to process information and the likes in your brain. And that usually is a point of consternation for most people because they're used to their brain working well. And then it gets to this point where it's not working as well as it used to. Now, that is a marker, but it's not a fatal marker where a lot of people think that because their brains aren't as sharp and as clear as it was when they were younger, that they are going down a disease process. There's something called normal age-related cognitive decline. And the key terminology to that is the normal. It is normal when we start to see our cognition starting to wane with age, because just like our body, our brain goes through changes. When our body ages, we don't have the robust muscular skeleton and the exoskeleton that we did when we were younger. All of those things start to diminish with age, and that is what parts of physical aging. We start seeing things like our eyesight diminish, and we start to see things like age-related macular degeneration, cataract, and glaucoma as the aging process hits our eyes. And our brain is no different than that. And so there's some remarkable features about the brain that sort of put this into focus. Next slide. So the adult brain weighs about 3 pounds. It's about 2% of the body weight. And that 3 pounds between your ears is responsible for controlling everything. It doesn't slumber, it doesn't sleep. It is the vital quarterback of your entire body. Now, when we talk about the brain and its relationship to how we live our lives and making sure that we're achieving overall brain health for a lifespan, there are certain parts of neuron pathology that is really germane to this discussion. And that is specifically that neurons are like no other cell in the body. So let me kind of really couch that within a story. If all of us were to go ahead and donate a pint of red blood cells, which govern our circulatory system and provide oxygen and nutrients throughout our whole body, if we were to donate a pint of that to the Red Cross, by tomorrow evening, we would regenerate those red blood cells of which we donated. I scratch my skin and I slough off skin cells. Well, I don't get a hole in my hand because I scratched my hand. New skin cells will grow and regenerate. Every morning, because I don't want to grow a beard, I shave because by the next morning, I'm going to have all sorts of stubble growing back. Those cells start to grow back again and again. And women, you have a little bit of the same problem. You have to shave your legs on a regular basis as well. So we're usually used to our cells in our body being able to replicate themselves and repair and go forth. Well, neurons are like no other cell in the body. When a neuron dies, it's gone for good. It's not coming back. So when we start to talk about these age-related neurodegenerative diseases, we have a finite amount of neurons in our brain, and neurodegeneration threatens the functions that are attached to our neurons. Now, our neurons govern our central nervous system, our brain, down our spinal cord, and all of our nerve endings that innervate all of our muscles and bring feedback to our brain on a constant basis. And so when the flow or the connectivity of those neurons is interrupted by neurodegeneration, those functions that are associated with that neuronic pathway ceases to come to fruition. And so this is where we get those neurodegenerative diseases. And so knowing this, we are in a race to save our neurons, the nature of how our brain is wired and connected. And then secondly, brain metabolism. And this is the second important point that we need to get into as we're looking at how to keep our brains healthy and the importance of doing this, because it is the quarterback of our entire body. So our brain is the most metabolic organ in our entire body. About 27% of all the food that we eat and about 27% of all the oxygen we breathe in go to power our brain.
Looks like we lost Dr. Browne there. So I'm just going to jump in for a quick second here, and hopefully we can get him back on the line to pick up where he left off. It seems like we've been riddled with technical difficulties over the past couple of sessions, but we'll see if we can bring Dr. Browne back into the equation shortly here. But the reason why I thought that this was so critical, there's Dr. Browne. Excellent. Let me bring Dr. Browne back into the equation. I will jump back in.
Yeah, let me just make sure that everything is good. All right. Okay, I apologize for that. So again, brain, most metabolic organ in the entire body. And that's really important, because the hunger and thirst of our brain tell a story in terms of how we need to truly work with preserving all of the function by making sure that it's getting what it needs. So again, I'm going to come back to those 2 points as we go on in our lecture: the pathology of our neurons and the metabolism of our brains. Those are very important aspects that we want to be able to talk about and come back to. Now, many people, when it comes to aging and brain health and disease susceptibility, are always under the auspices that our genetics are the predictor of our future disease susceptibility, our aging, our longevity, and our quality of life. That has been a well-held belief forever, that our genetics control all of that. Well, I'm sorry to have to burst your bubble, but research and science have really indicated that that is not the case. Our genetics are part of the story, but they are not the entire story. So we're living longer. Longevity is an all-time high. We're seeing the brain age like we haven't seen it before. We're looking at Alzheimer's disease and related dementias being the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. So we're seeing this rise of incidence of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. And people are scared spitless because it appears that they have a lineage for dementia or some type of neurodegenerative diseases that stack up in their genetics that put them at increased risk. And so there's a lot of people in fear right now, believing that they're next in a long lineage of people who will come down with some form of Alzheimer's. Now, I'm here to speak science to you, and that aspect of Alzheimer's being a genetic disease is actually not true. Alzheimer's disease is not a genetic disease. And a number of you out there are probably going, that can't be true because we've got a whole long line of people. Well, only 5% of Alzheimer's is genetic. And you have to have a double copy of the apolipoprotein 4 allele, TOM40 gene, the ABCA7 gene. These genetic predisposition genes, a double copy of them, but only 5% of the world's population has those genes. 95% of Alzheimer's is what we call sporadic Alzheimer's disease, which is a confluence of risk factors. So the more risk stratification that you have in your life, the greater your risk of Alzheimer's disease. And then you say, well, Dr. Browne, how does this explain this whole line of people, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and so on and so forth? So they worked research, and research pointed to an epidemiological risk, not a genetic risk, meaning that we do the same things that our parents did, and our parents did the same things that our grandparents did, and our grandparents did the same thing that our great-grandparents did. We do the same things and get the same results. And so when we looked at all the risk factors that really pervaded these families, they all did the same things. And so we looked epidemiologically, and they carried on the same activities, same traits, same diet, same body movement, same everything, and therefore were predisposed to what? The same amount of risk for this. But it wasn't genetic. Because again, remember, only 5% carry the genetic marker for the disease. The rest is what? A confluence of risk factors. So what they did was copy the same risk factors from generation to generation. Risk factors that are modifiable, but they copied them and therefore had an epidemiological risk, but not a genetic risk for the disease. And that's the good news, is the fact that it wasn't genetic. And in terms of disease susceptibility, aging, and quality of life, and all of those things, those also are not genetic. Next slide. We learned that this is true. Your DNA is not your destiny. Your DNA is not your destiny. The DNA you're born with is not the DNA you die with. And you're saying, how can that be? What are you talking about? So there are things like on you that are immutable, meaning your eye color, your skin color, all of those things are immutable aspects of your DNA that cling to you. And others are just correlative risk. So there is, when you have a genetic disease, you have 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 chromosomes from dad. And if you have a bad copy on both sets of chromosomes, then that will come to a genetic disease. And that is something that will be expressed, like the 5% of people who will have the genetic version of Alzheimer's. But everything else is a correlative risk, meaning that you may have a propensity for something, but it doesn't mean that that is going to be expressed. So there's a science called the science of epigenetics. Next slide. And the science of epigenetics tells us this, that first, it changes that occur in your cells when you're exposed to potentially detrimental, modifiable environmental and behavioral influences, meaning that we are a product of what influences our genetic makeup. And so we have this genetic structure, but we have a lot of things that influence that genetic structure. And the things that influence our genetic structure have more say than just the genetics themselves. And so epigenetics tells us that you are seeing changes in your epigenome by virtue of what you put yourself at risk to. And so this is part of the science of brain health here. in terms that you will have some risk for a number of different things, but those risks don't come to fruition unless we engage in practices that therefore put us into not just to be correlative, but it is causative of those changes. Next slide. And so epigenetics tell us that these chemical modifications on our cells, they will allow disease genes to be either switched on or stay silent. So right now, we have oncogenes floating around in our body right now as we speak. And our job is to keep those oncogenes or those cancer genes switched off by therefore making sure our behaviors, our environment, and our lifestyle is conducive to keeping them switched off. But if we put ourselves in high risk environments or in behaviors and lifestyles and so on and so forth, these are the things that take that correlative risk to a causative risk and switch on those genes that were at one point were silenced. So epigenetics continues to tell us this. And so how is it researched? And so all over the world, we did twin studies. And twins are born with an identical twins are born with an identical copy of DNA, identical. So we're able to map them right from the get-go and so identical genes. And then as the twins start to grow, maybe one goes to college in California, the other one goes to college in Ohio, and they have different exposures and influences and behaviors. And through longitudinal study all over the world over a period of time, we see these epigenetic changes to a DNA that was once identical. We start to see these divergent patterns. We start to see the expression look completely different from one twin to another. And then we start to see disease risk elevate in one where it stays muted in another. Or we start to see some protection in one twin and rampant expression of some other things, some premature aging or some abnormal things in another. And it's all due to this epigenetic continuum. And so epigenetics start to explain a lot of the scenario wherein we have a situation that otherwise you'd think everything would be considered equal. But this is the good news with epigenetic research. It's this. We have control over our rate of aging and our risk for disease. And so as people are living longer and people are crossing their fingers and hoping that their aging brains hold up and that this senior moment is nothing more than a senior moment and not on a fast track accelerant to some type of dementia. We know through epigenetic research that we can then control our risk for a lot of these chronic diseases, but most of all, these neurodegenerative diseases of aging. And that is really an important takeaway that science and research has sort of ramped up and allowed us to understand that our risk isn't as it was first thought of before. So that's great news. That's fantastic news. And so that was confirmed when we actually found out probably just a little over a decade ago about how the continuum of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias start to play themselves out. We learned something new in research that really changed the course of how we research and look at the disease itself. And typically, this is what happens. In my clinic, we manage, the prevention and risk reduction of abnormal aging, Alzheimer's and related dementias, and so on and so forth, and even early dementia. And so what happens for most people is, in terms of Alzheimer's and related dementias, is how do we know somebody has Alzheimer's or related dementia? Typically, you will tell us. And when I say you will tell us, typically it'll be an adult child, a spouse, someone comes home at Thanksgiving or Christmas and just says, oh man, mom and dad, they're really not they're really not their best right now. We see some difficulty. We see a lot of things that we really shouldn't be seeing. And so that starts the continuum, is that these changes, and then they want to get it checked out. And at the point of checking out, we go through a battery of neuropsychological exams. There's medical imaging, there's blood work. There's a lot of things that we use to sort of tease out whether something is a pseudo dementia or a real dementia. But what we learned in research really changed the game in terms of how we look at this disease. Next slide. So what we see is this. Alzheimer's disease does not start with your first lost memory. It starts 25 to 30 years before your first day of forgetfulness. Alzheimer's brain changes start at around age 40. And then progressively, we start to see neurodegeneration take place. But when people are clinically diagnosed, they're typically in their late 60s or early 70s. And so we have this 25 to 30 year area of mischief that we don't know what's going on in the brain. We don't know if the brain is aging normally, or is it subject to abnormal aging and this neurodegeneration that happens over time. So this is what we see, and this is the normal course of what we see when people who start to experience things, i.e. a senior moment or something more, and have those questions. What's going on? And by that time, like I said, Alzheimer's disease does not start with your first lost memory. That neurodegeneration has started 25 to 30 years before. Let's talk about that slide that I said we're going to have to refer back to. What do you know about neurons now? Neurons don't regenerate. When a neuron dies, it's gone for good. So this neurodegeneration that has taken place 25 to 30 years prior and continues to go on until you become symptomatic, neurons can't regenerate. And so when we diagnose Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia, it becomes part of the continuum of a terminal disease. A terminal disease because we can't get the neurons back that have died that made you symptomatic at this point. That's where we sort of come into play where, oh boy, we're in a little bit of difficulty. We're in a little bit of trouble. So that is part and parcel of some of the things that have transpired in terms of understanding and looking at this disease process. It started, you were asymptomatic until you became clinically diagnosed. And so when we talk about really brain health, we're talking about the preclinical portion first and foremost, before you start to show the clinical symptoms. Now, there's a post-clinical symptoms brain health part of the equation as well. But most of it is focused on the preclinical, what is happening before you start to show the clinical symptoms. How do we really control neurodegeneration? And so this is where the classic words of prevention come into play. How do we prevent or reduce our risk for Alzheimer's, dementia, neurodegeneration, abnormal aging, et cetera, et cetera? Next slide. So we start to get into this area. How do we focus? Prevention. So primary prevention is the gold standard. Primary prevention is the gold standard of all of this. We want to prevent disease or injury before it occurs. And so this is through everything from intervention, removing exposure to the risk factors. And so this is where that epigenetic, that topic of epigenetics becomes germane, because we know that we can influence our disease genes, our longevity, and our susceptibility for all of this abnormal aging, that we can influence it. And so that's where epigenetics is in vogue. Primary prevention. We are going to start to do things that will, in a positive way, affect our epigenome. So we want to, in terms of the work that I do, primary prevention in terms of brain health and the risk reduction of neurodegenerative diseases. And so that's important, but it's going upstream to prevent the downstream damage. And then there's secondary prevention, and that's to reduce the impact of the disease that has already occurred. So at the earliest stages of diagnosis, how can I stop or slow the progress of this particular disease? And so it's at the earliest clinical manifestation of the disease. And so we want to make sure that it stays in that area and that we can have the best quality of life from that point onward. And this is why the terms early detection matters. The sooner that we can do that, the sooner that we can start throwing everything at intervention to arrest where that disease process started. And then there's tertiary prevention, which is to reduce the impact or slow the rate of an established disease. And so this is, like I said, after you've been diagnosed at more of a latent stage, what can we do to truly improve your quality of life, improve the symptoms that surround there, and slow the progression so that you can have the best, most robust life within that disease state. So all of these are important aspects, but the gold standard is primary prevention. We really want to get our arms around this in a primary preventative way. And in terms of what I do, in terms of the brain and the diseases of the brain, that's where we have to focus on all of those things. And it takes reciprocal effort. It takes reciprocal effort in terms of being able to do that. Now, there has been a tremendous amount of research in my field that has gone into the notion of primary prevention. And this year concluded some longitudinal research in terms of looking at dementia risk and how we can reduce our risk for dementia. That was really, really apropos for where we are today, but really it's hope burgeoning. Next slide. So the Lancet reported that dementia prevention and intervention and care, that they concluded that we really can prevent in a primary way the dementia rates that we continue to see over time. That is fantastic news. And it's research that my clinic has been based on for a number of years. In terms of looking at how we can absolutely reduce our risk for dementia, which people thought, and still do, unfortunately, think it's a genetic disease. And again, the research continues to point out that that's not the case. Prevention and intervention is out there. You just kind of need to be case managed. That's really what we're now knowing and espousing, and that's exactly what my clinic does. It's this case management of your stratified risk. And so the Lancet was very clear about there's tremendous prevention and intervention that can be done to reduce all of these dramatic worldwide rates of dementia. Fantastic news. Next slide. Again, more news that comes out that talks about dementia risk factors identified in this global report that are all preventable, and we can address them and we can reduce dementia rates almost by half. This should be trumpeted off every rooftop, but for whatever reason, this news isn't getting out to anybody. People have to know that we really can start to truly get our arms around this, and it starts off with prevention. It's all about prevention. And so understanding that the neurodegenerative process is permanent and terminal and progressive. So prevention staves off that progressive nature. It tamps it down. That's the intervention that we're talking about that slows this down so that you stay in the, quote, preclinical phase, as opposed to start going down the road of disease progression. And this is fantastic news for everybody to hear. But here's the problem. Our American lifestyle really is conducive for this, and this is the next slide. Our American lifestyle tells us this: I'm willing to make some lifestyle changes as long as I don't have to do anything different. And this is where we live. We want it all, but we don't want to put the effort in. And we have to be able to break through the malaise of not wanting to put the effort in. The research is robust. It's clear that we can move towards prevention in terms of these neurodegenerative diseases, but it's going to take effort. It's going to take effort in terms of having the right experts case manage you, but effort on your part, because you will then modify your epigenetic risk to Alzheimer's and related dementias, to abnormal aging, and to your chronic disease risk. This is fantastic news that for everybody, but it's going to have to get us out of our comfort zones of wanting everything, but doing nothing to support it. So our brains, created with these trillions of neurons and these neuronal connections that allow us to functionally be everything that we are. Our job is to keep those intact. So think about this. Our bodies, entire bodies, are created with the use it or lose it phenomenon. If I then say that, you know what, I'm going to start doing some arm curls, and I'm going to use this 50-pound dumbbells, and I'm going to start doing some arm curls. You know, I start doing these arm curls, and over time, the blood supply to my bicep is going to start to increase, because the demand for nutrients and oxygen are going to increase, because I'm increasing the amount of load or work on my bicep. So more blood, which means more oxygen and nutrients, which means that that muscle will start to grow, which means that muscle is going to become stronger, which means that I'm going to be able to perform more tasks with my bicep because I am exercising it. There's more oxygen and nutrients, it's stronger, and I am continuing to exercise. Now, our brain works the same way as our body. Our brain has a circumscribed way that it needs to function, and it needs to be engaged. And so there is the principle of cognitive reserve that is in play for each one of us. And cognitive reserve, next slide, is this mechanism that the brain continually is monitoring itself and changing. Unused connections get pruned. So if your brain is not engaged, if you have these neuronal connections that are just there and not being engaged, similar to a muscle on your body that is not being worked or engaged, that muscle is going to shrink and the blood supply is going to diminish because it's not being used. Your brain works under the same principle. So these unused neuronal connections are going to get pruned, while used connections get strengthened, just the same way that the blood supply increases and you get more vasculature in those areas that are used in your body. The same is true for your brain. And this process continues throughout life, that your brain is constantly looking at how it can optimize itself for the good and for the bad. So an engaged brain is a cognitively strong brain that allows it to stay healthier and intact more. So this is the principle. We want to have as much cognitive reserve as we can. And next slide. And cognitive reserve will provide a resilience and a plasticity that helps all your cognitive networks work better, even in the face of disruption. So there's many disruptive factors in your brain, and we're going to talk about a few when we talk about more primary prevention. That cognitive reserve helps those neuronal connections stay intact longer. So you need this robust cognitive reserve, or this cognitive network, so that even in the face of opposition, your brain still stays connected and it still stays strong. And this is part of primary prevention, meaning I have to engage and exercise my brain so that it can stay strong and withstand some of the abnormal aging that may take place. Beta amyloid pathology, tau pathology, neurofibrillary tangles, neuroinflammation, all of those things that threaten all of these neuronal connections and accelerate abnormal aging through these changes in the brain. cognitive reserve starts to hold as long as it can, even in the face of this disruption. So it's real important that this is the basis. We want as much reserve or as much brain strength as we can, and that is one of the tools for primary prevention. Next slide. So this summarizes all the research that is sort of at play in terms of, we know that there are discernible risk factors to preventing premature abnormal cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and related dementias. And so we know things like unhealthy diet, alcohol misuse and smoking and diabetes and depression and stress all are contributing risk factors for an unhealthy brain environment. And we also know that high blood pressure, obesity, high blood cholesterol, and hearing loss are all other contributory risk factors. But then there are these protective things. And that goes to that, like I said, that go into that whole cognitive reserve aspect. And this is the research that I engage in and the things that we do in our clinic. One, we do reduce your risk factors, one. But secondarily, we want to make sure that we're making sure that you engage in protective factors as well. And those protective factors, physical activity. We talked about making sure that you have enough oxygen in your brain, because your brain is the most metabolic organ in your body. So, and this is true with any part of your body. So think about this. Anything in your body that is deprived of oxygen dies. I tie a rubber band around the tip of my finger, and all of a sudden, time after, over a matter of days and so on, the tip of my finger will turn black and necrotic, and it will die because it doesn't have any oxygen getting there. So anything void of oxygen dies. So physical activity is the God-given way for us to use our left ventricle to pump out fresh oxygenated blood to our body and our brain specifically. Specifically our brain, because again, our brain is the most metabolic organ in our body. If we don't get enough oxygen to our brain, we start to encounter a hypoxic effect. What I just said before, anything void of oxygen starts to die. This hypoxic effect in the brain starts to kill neurons, again, neurons that can't be regenerated, and starts the continuum of neurodegeneration. Do you know one of the quickest ways physical activity and things like sleep apnea, not providing your brain oxygen while you sleep, quickest ways to that type of neuronal death, lack of oxygen, but you need to move your body to move the oxygen to your brain. And then of course, we talk about cognitive and social activity. Remember, engaging your brain. You got to engage your brain. You cannot be cognitively lazy, just the same way you can't be physically lazy. Got to work. And social engagement is another way. And then looking at a thriving gut microbiome. As a nutritional neuroscientist, I'm fully engaged and enveloped in looking at how food and our gut provide those protections for our brain. And more to come on that. The research is robust. I do presentations on that all the time. And then looking at inflammation. Inflammation is a killer of our bodies, and this is the accelerant to chronic disease and neurodegenerative disease. And so we have to lower inflammation. So looking at all of those protective factors as well. So again, we're stumbling into this whole continuum of accidental aging. Accidental aging, like I said, we're not aging with intention. What you're looking at in this slide is embracing intentional aging. Only a small part is those genetic factors, and you see the majority of it is reducing our risk and then looking at the protective factors. To the tune of our aging and disease susceptibility genes account for 25% of our risk. The lion's share of all of risk comes from what we know as lifestyle or behavioral or epigenetic risk. And so that's why it's so important to understand this continuum of prevention, specifically with our brain, because it's the most important. It's the quarterback of our body. We have to preserve our brain because there are no second chances. We have this finite amount of neurons, and when they're gone, the function that's attached to those neuronal connections ceases, and this is where we get these neurodegenerative diseases of aging. So we really have to get our arms around that. So let's talk about the future direction of research in these areas. Next slide. So we want to really understand in terms of prevention a number of things. The critical windows when risk modification is the most effective. So when should we start the primary prevention and the modalities? And so we want to know when is the best therapeutic windows to do that. So that's what we're working on. Identifying the who is at risk and where the risk comes from. And so there may be certain subpopulations and regional differences and gender differences and all sorts of other aspects that may be at accelerated risk. And so we want to make sure that everybody, the research that we do, and everybody is protected at the right place and time. We need better measures so that we see that the results we get are translatable into actionable steps. So those are all important as well. And then we need better cognitive measures so that we know and are sensitive to people who in a younger cohort. That's really important because this is a lifelong disease. Remember, I showed you that slide that the brain changes start at in adulthood, and we want to make sure those brain changes aren't on towards the end where we become symptomatic. We want to keep things in the preclinical stage. So we want to focus on a younger cohort to keep our brains healthy and have more plasticity over a longer period of time. And then we want to include cognitive measures as secondary outcomes in trials. And so we want to be able to map things in the new research as well. And we really want to do things on a longitudinal basis. We want to have a long-term snapshot of all the research we do so that we can track it over time. So we're really looking at that in research of looking at how we get our arms around this preclinical aspect of the aging brain and trying to be preventative and keep it healthy for as long as we live. Because like I said before, we're living longer, but we want to maintain quality of life and age well that is coupled with this increased longevity that we're seeing over time. Next slide. There are some surprise things that have come out of research lately. One is the fact that we see that some of the active ingredients in Ozempic have looked to reduce risk for Alzheimer's disease. It was unintended consequences. In this article that just came out last week, they quoted me. They interviewed me for this article and talked about all of the needs of a very metabolic brain that this drug is able to kind of biohack and allow our brain metabolism to work better and therefore reduce our risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so we're finding out just new things every day with the research. And so I'd like to end on this. I put together kind of like a recipe for enhancing brain health. And it kind of incorporates a lot of what we were talking about, but all of it requires effort. Your brains and your longevity and your disease susceptibility all require effort if we're going to be on a preventative tip. And so next slide. So this is what I espouse, a daily dose of 30-minute exercise, 3 daily doses of brain and gut healthy diet, daily dose of mental activity and cognitive stimulation. And then we have 3 weekly doses of social activity, and a daily dose of stress reduction, positive thinking, meditation, prayer, and a nightly dose of 7 to 8 hours sleep. This is kind of my biohacking simplistic formula for really looking at embracing brain health and the ability to, look at primary prevention so that with this increasing longevity, we can have wonderful quality of life. And the quarterback of our body, which is our brain, being able to function at a high level throughout our lifespan so we don't live in fear as we age, wondering if one of these neurodegenerative diseases of aging is going to befall you. So that's kind of my closing recipe for brain health. Next slide. And I am open if there are any questions before we close this broadcast.
First of all, just want to say thank you again. Tremendous, really important information. I can tell you that something in particular hit me really pretty heavy here, because I have, you talked a little bit about twin studies,
Yes.
which I had my own, my opportunity to experience one of those twin studies firsthand.
Mm.
So my father, who just literally turned 90 almost 2 weeks ago, had a mirror image identical twin. And they were born in New York City. They went off to Korea in the Air Force together. They came back, went to school at NYU together. They ended up moving to an apartment building in Queens with their young families, moved upstate, bought houses 2 houses down from each other, commuted into the city for work together in the same car every day for years. Primary difference: my father was a very social being. At his 90th birthday, he still had 55 people there. He has conversations on the telephone with his friends who he's known for years. He's a Jeopardy fanatic. He does crossword puzzles every day.
Yep.
He spends a ton of time researching history. He is actively engaged in conversations with me every single day about my practice, health, and my business. Unfortunately, my uncle 2 years ago passed away from dementia. My uncle didn't have the same kind of lifestyle habits that my dad did. So everything that you just described from a perspective of the science-based approach to keeping your brain healthy, and the epigenetics element of that, and the environmental factors that you're describing that come into play, that is a perfect scientific experiment to demonstrate exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Not saying my dad hasn't slowed down a little bit.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
a very, very clear differentiator that he personally experienced and that I've witnessed. Thank you.
Yeah, it's that effort piece that I talked about. Your dad put that effort into all of those areas, and they paid dividends.
No doubt, no doubt. So as you're talking, and we the concept of these talks is centered around tinnitus, but the brain is clearly the central element of this. And you touched upon the concept of hearing loss as being one of the preventable risk factors for cognitive decline, or kind of impaired brain function as we go through life. Hearing loss is, for most patients, the reason why we experience the symptom of tinnitus in the first place. So oftentimes when we have conversations with patients that say, one of the key things to manage is, let's manage your hearing loss as well, because that will not only impact your tinnitus oftentimes in a positive way, but it's also going to be the long-term benefit from a perspective of your tinnitus, for your hearing loss and your brain health as well.
Yep.
I wanted to ask you a question specifically about kind of lower hanging fruit and the effort that you talk about, because when we talk to patients about tinnitus care, we talk about the low hanging fruit being sleep, which is critical, some sort of movement and exercise. We have the psychology piece, and we also have the kind of the technology piece comes in last. I want to talk about the exercise piece. Explain to us how exercise helps keep our brains healthy, because this is something that I have my arms around, but I don't have it around, just like you do as a neuroscientist and a brain scientist.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. So there are specific growth factors, brain-derived growth factors, that only come into play through the process of exercise. It's just as phenomenal. When we move our body, we have these protective growth factors that develop for our brain that thrives. I also mentioned the fact that moving oxygen, it is the primary way that we then oxygenate our brain as well. And again, moving nutrients along the continuum in terms of that. Now, physical activity starts to bleed into a number of the other risk factors. So when you exercise and move your body, you will sleep better, which again, we talked about, sleep being one of those aspects. There's more things like weight control. So obesity then the rates of obesity then get reduced, because we know obesity is a precursor to all sorts of abnormal, dysfunctional metabolic things, i.e. the type 2 diabetes and so on and so forth. Moving your body, again, starts to reduce things like your blood pressure and all that. So it's this cataclysmic thing that starts to really upper hand optimize your brain and your body by primary and secondary means to be able to give our brain what it actually needs to. And here's the other thing. Our brains were created to be explorers. And this is important. So through physical activity, whether it's Tai Chi, whether it's doing on a spin bike or whatever, our brain during physical activity starts this next level exploration that doesn't happen when we're sedentary. And so we start to see literally all of the growth factors and all the protective factors start to increase and improve, because it starts down this primary exploration track that doesn't happen when you're not exercising. And it is really radically something that is germane to the brain, but only when we move our bodies. So going for that walk down the street and seeing and observing and having everything, it's physical activity, and it strengthens the exploration aspect of your brain.
Wonderful. Yeah, I even think about the physical elements of, something as simple as like progressive muscle relaxation. And in terms of how there's different parts of the brain that kind of light up based on the body part, right? There's relaxation element associated with that. And oftentimes we'll use that as a technique for patients who are, bothered by their tinnitus, and it helps to downregulate their system, and it relaxes every element of their physical being, but it ultimately has a lot of benefit for their brain as well. Even if they're not moving necessarily, they're still activating different parts of the brain, right? Yeah. So if you had to pick, and what you laid out for us was this recipe, and I agree with you 100%. I think that all of that is, and these are things that I practice myself for a whole variety of reasons. But for some people, the biggest excuse is I don't have the time to incorporate all of this into my day-to-day, right? So if you had to pick out the one thing in the recipe that has the biggest bang for the buck that would help us with brain health, if we can only do one thing out of all those, what would that be?
Oh, wow. That is really, really tough.
Well, the reason why I asked that question, and I realize that that's a complete, like, it's against everything that you talk about. It's against everything that I talk about. But I think about those patients where we're trying to incorporate so many different variables and elements into their life, and they've maybe done none of this stuff. Maybe the better question is, what's the easiest starting point for patients like that?
So I will start with this. I will start and say sleep. Because it is something that we all have to do. And why sleep? Because 3 specific things happen when you sleep. And when you sleep, with good sleep hygiene. And that's the other thing. You got to prepare to go to sleep. There's a hygiene that you need to incorporate so that you're getting the most out of sleep. But sleep does 3 primary things for your brain. 1, memory formation happens when you sleep. So as you're taking in all the data and stimuli of a regular day, and you're going through every last thing that happened during the day, your brain has to account for all of that. And it happens only when you sleep, that memory formation, where your brain can sort out what gets converted into long-term memory, what gets stored to the dormant parts of your brain, all of those things, what detail is germane, what isn't germane. Memory formation only happens when you sleep. So if you don't get good sleep, or you get interrupted sleep, this is where people have these foggy, interrupted memories and so on and so forth. And so memory formation, first thing. Second is clearing out beta amyloid from the brain. So our brain naturally produces beta amyloid. It's a natural thing in life. But when we get too much beta amyloid, it aggregates in the brain, becomes toxic, and we start to see the toxicity manifest itself in neurodegeneration. And this is where we start to see the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease.
Mhm.
While you sleep is the only time beta amyloid can be cleared out of your brain. So without sleep, you are inviting that type of toxic neuroinflammation, that atmosphere, to go into play. Sleep, important for clearing up beta amyloid. And 3, cellular repair. Cellular repair for the body and brain only happen while you sleep.
Mhm.
So all the worn out, all the tired, all the things that need to be kind of recharged and regenerated can only happen under the auspices of sleep. So if you're not sleeping, you're having a worn out body, a worn out everything, which is an inflammation aggregator. And I talked about inflammation being one of the key risks of this whole continuum. So just getting sleep, you've solved some inflammation, some neurodegeneration, memory formation, cellular recovery, all sorts of things by just really focusing in on sleep.
Perfect. Yeah, we have Dr. Janet Kennedy, who's a clinical psychologist here in New York, who's a sleep health expert. She'll be coming up in the upcoming weeks. But I
Right.
agree with you. Sleep and tinnitus are intimately linked, and the challenge that we face is there's kind of a chicken and egg. Unfortunately, some patients cannot get to sleep because they're so bothered by their tinnitus, and then if
Yeah.
they're not getting into these, it's not only quantity of sleep, as we know, it's the quality. As you're
Quality.
saying, it's the deep
Absolutely.
REM stages that matter, and the percentage of their total sleep. And if they're not getting into those rejuvenative stages of sleep, they're getting out of bed, and their body and their brain are physiologically and psychologically stressed, which
Yes.
then ultimately leads to the fuel for their tinnitus in many ways, right? Because
Yeah.
we know stress will fuel that as well. So I agree with you 100%. I think that's something that we focus heavily on with our patients, as well as the sleep health elements of it. But tying it in with the long-term brain health elements is even a stronger argument now, because it's not just about the short term. You need to get sleep to help with your tinnitus. You need to get better sleep and quality sleep consistently over time to keep your brain healthy over time. So beautiful. Well, I
Absolutely.
kept you a little over here, and I have to tell you, I really appreciate you and the work that you do. I really do appreciate you sharing all of this knowledge. I know we just scratched the surface, because I've
Yeah.
had in-depth conversations with you where it's just like, no pun, but mind blown completely with the stuff that you're doing out there in Scottsdale, and all of your projects that you're involved in. I would hope that at some point we would be able to continue this conversation and go a little bit further in depth with some of these concepts. But for now, I just want to say thank you on behalf of myself, everybody who's listening, and everybody who will watch this in the future. Definitely made a big impact on the group here. So thank you so much, Dr. Browne.
Yeah, my pleasure. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Awesome. And for all of you that have stuck around, make sure that you do register for the upcoming Tinnitus Collaborative Sessions. That website is right there. Our next session will be this upcoming Thursday with Patrick Lynch, who is the CEO of the American Tinnitus Association. That will be part presentation, part fireside chat. So I hope you all can join us then for that session as well. With that said, just want to say thank you to everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Dr. Browne, take good care. I will see you soon as well.